the time The Diary of Anne Frank debuted in 1955, its writers, Albert Hackett and his wife, Frances Goodrich, were already established Hollywood writers. They had received Academy Award nominations for several works. The Diary of Anne Frank would earn them the 1956 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. In 1959, Goodrich and Hackett adapted their stage play for a movie version that would later win 3 Academy Awards. Goodrich and Hackett based their masterwork on the book Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. Anne Frank, a Jewish teenager, wrote the diary over a 2-year period while she, her family, and others hid from the Nazis in the German-occupied Netherlands until their capture in 1944. Anne's father, the only survivor of the group, recovered the diary in 1945. He sold it to Dutch publishers in 1947. Otto Frank, Anne's father, Mr. Frank, owned the building that concealed the secret annex. Anne often refers to him as Pim. Edith Frank, Otto's wife and mother to Anne and Margot. Anne Frank, a teenage Jewish girl who records her family's experience in the secret annex in the diary her father gives her on her 13th birthday. Margot Frank, Anne's older sister. She is quiet, mature, and respectful. Mr. Van Daan, a large man, often greedy and selfish about food. Mr. Van Daan helped Mr. Frank in business when the Franks arrived in Holland. Mr. Frank repaid the debt by agreeing to hide the Van Daans in the secret annex. Mrs. Van Daan, flirtatious and materialistic, Mrs. Van Daan often clashes with the selfless and quiet Mrs. Frank. She disapproves of Anne on several occasions. Peter Van Daan, a quiet boy a few years older than Anne. Mr. Dussel, a dentist who retreats when Nazis discover his Jewish roots. His neuroses become disruptive. Miep Gies, a worker at the factory who supports the occupants of the secret annex by bringing them food and news from the outside world. Mr. Crawler, a former business associate of Mr. Frank, who also helps the families. Act 1, Scene 1. The play opens in 1945 as Otto Frank returns to the secret annex, the concealed rooms above his former business where his family hid for 2 years. This space is the setting for the play. Miep Gies joins him and hands him Anne's diary, which she has saved from the Nazis. Frank begins reading the diary, initiating a flashback to the day the family went into hiding. Act 1, Scene 2. When the curtain rises, the Van Daans enter the secret annex. Mr. Frank explains that the occupants must remain silent during the day while work goes on in the factory below. The audience also meets Mr. Crawler. At the end of the scene, Mr. Frank gives Anne the diary. Act 1, Scene 3. Tension develops in the secret annex. Anne and the Van Daan's son Peter antagonize each other. Mr. Van Daan harangues Peter over his studies. Mrs. Van Daan overly flirts with Otto Frank. The scene ends with the arrival of Mr. Dussel, who joins the two families in hiding. Mr. Frank decides Anne must share her room with Dussel, setting up more tension. Act 1, Scene 4. Months later, Anne experiences a nightmare that awakens everyone in the annex. Anne tells her father that she wants to be good, but can't control the way she acts out. The audience gets the first glimpse of Dussel's chronic neurosis that contribute to an ongoing conflict with the other occupants. Act 1, Scene 5. One of the recurring elements in the play is the waves of emotional highs and lows that the occupants experience. Here, the characters enjoy Hanukkah. Anne attempts to make amends for behavior by giving everyone a handmade gift. As the celebration reaches a crescendo, Peter clumsily breaks a light. The noise triggers a loud commotion downstairs. The occupants realize a burglar has broken into the building. Anne faints with dread at the thought of getting caught. The scene and act end with a somber rendition of a Hanukkah song. Act 2, Scene 1. The family, now in hiding for nearly 2 years, celebrates New Year's Day, 1944. Miep arrives with a cake, but a squabble ensues over Mrs. Van Daan's favoring her husband with larger portions. Anne seeks out a meaningful friendship with Peter. Mr. Crawler fears one of the workers knows about the secret annex and wants to blackmail them. Anne chastises both families for their negativity. Act 2, Scene 2. Anne and Peter become closer. Neither Mrs. Van Daan nor Mrs. Frank approves of Anne and Peter spending time in Peter's room with the door closed. Later, Anne and Peter share a warm conversation that ends with Peter kissing Anne on the cheek. Act 2, Scene 3. The scene begins with Mrs. Frank catching Mr. Van Daan stealing food in the night. Mrs. Frank demands that Van Daan find a new hiding place. Anne rushes to Peter's defense, and Mrs. Frank agrees the boy can stay. Peter declines the offer, demonstrating loyalty to his father. Miep then rushes in with the news of the Allied D-Day invasion of Europe. The elated families apologize for their behavior. Act 2, Scene 4. A ringing telephone below the secret annex signals the climax of the play. Everyone debates answering the phone, but Mr. Frank refuses to fall for what may be a trick. Anne and Peter share a final tender moment. Anne tells Peter that in spite of everything, she believes people are truly good at heart. The scene ends with the sound of heavy boots on the stairs outside the secret annex. The occupants gather their belongings, awaiting arrest. Act 2, Scene 5. It's November 1945. Mr. Frank is still reading the diary. He tells Miep that he found a woman who was with Anne when she died in a concentration camp. We hear Anne's disembodied voice repeat, "In spite of everything, I still believe people are good at heart," as Mr. Frank closes the diary. He says, "She puts me to shame." After a pause, the curtain closes. It's a tribute to Anne Frank herself, as well as playwrights Hackett and Goodrich, that audiences remember the Diary of Anne Frank for its optimistic message about humanity, as well as for the tragic circumstances in which it was written. Part historical drama, part coming-of-age story, the play depicts Anne Frank's passage to maturity and the highs and lows experienced by a group of people hiding from the horrors of Nazi concentration camps.